as a disclaimer, I tell people all the time, number one, I have a hobby that as a health economist, and I'm a free market health economist. I used to tell people that, um, the free market folks meet in a phone booth, but no one knows what a phone booth is anymore. So that's lost some of its relevance. But suffice it to say, there aren't many that ascribe to free market principles, but I do. So there'll be a lot of that sort of view of the world, say a little bit to the right of Milton Friedman. But I really do believe, and I think our firm believes in the power of some markets, and we're seeing things. I think things are changing in a very interesting way. We tend to work with those firms that I talked about, healthcare providers, I think more skewed to ambulatory providers, very focused. We are very focused on home and community. We think there's a major opportunity. That's sort of where the puck is going. We do work with acute care facilities, but very focused on ambulatory, very focused on payer, and sort of the mashup or convergence space. Some people call that payvider or risk-bearing entity, but we've done a lot of work with, in particular, provider organizations that have taken, significant modicum of risk, payer organizations, and as I mentioned, health information technology vendors that support that sort of ecosystem concept, and similarly now with medical device firms. And I always describe our view, and again, I say this just to contrast with how you might think about it, and would love to hear that. My view is that all healthcare is local. There are best practices and national activities, obviously, but that all healthcare is local. And when I look at a market, I view that market through the lens of the healthcare economic activity in that market, right? And so the starting point is what's being spent, what's the size of that economy, what are the outcomes, and where are the opportunities for improve. And so we believe that part of our job is to help those markets transform, help those local ecosystems transform over time. So just, in terms of my lens, we are not in the life science space. We're squarely in the sort of traditional payer provider space, and excited about where things are going. And when we look in the rearview mirror, we see a lot of damage and fragmentation and an archaic system. But we think that there's an opportunity to change things, and that's in our work with the actual game changers. That's the work that we try to do. Everybody has a market dynamic slide. All of you are as qualified, if not more qualified than me, to talk about these market changes. But I just want to make a couple of points here that I think are really important, maybe even more sentinel or foundational than this. When I think about macro factors or environmental factors that are really, really setting the table and driving change for what I hope is a more consumer-centric health economy, and I'll talk about what that means, or a consumer experienced, outcomes experienced health economy, I think about a couple of things. I think about the big drivers. I think about aging, and I'll talk more about aging as we go, but we are obviously in the middle of, or maybe even in the first inning of, the most significant ramp expansion of our older populations in the history of this country. And pretty interesting given what's happened with birth rates. We'll hit the pinnacle maybe in 2032 or thereabouts, and then we'll start to plateau, but we're going to have obviously a massive push around aging. And in my mind, that means a couple of things. One is that means that we've got to figure out in our system how to better care for more folks that we know by definition have more needs. That's one element, right, of that. The second element of that is that, depending on what source you look at, there's a $7 trillion longevity economy. So seniors represent a powerful voice and a powerful set of economic actors that we have to be thoughtful about, right? And I think healthcare is a part of that equation. The third thing I think about is caregivers, right? And we now I think guesstimate that there's about a $500 billion of unfunded caregiver support that's provided in lieu of being paid. That's a big audience. I think one of the things that's interesting about some of the, I call them the insurgents, the non-healthcare actors, that are coming in, the retailers and others that have, much better consumer chops. I think part of what is attractive to them is the notion of the family as an economic unit and how aging might really drive or allow them to drive better outcomes in a business that hasn't been that focused on driving good outcomes for those families. So aging is one of those definite, big sort of factors, right, that I think about a lot. The second thing that I think about is that, we have these two massive entitlement programs, right? Medicare and Medicaid, both of which will be, in the ballpark, $1 trillion by 2030. And although people don't talk about it in this context, these programs are rapidly privatizing, right? We're going to see MA as a percentage of overall Medicare grow very rapidly. And, it seems like every time you look at the research, the prognostications about MA penetration go up and up and up. We know that there are massive new MA starts. There's a lot of innovation in the MA space. And on the Medicaid side, I think 40 plus states now are waiver states with an 1115 or 1915 waiver and are doing all kinds of other things and have created special purpose legislation and are driving managed care in those states. So those relationships, in essence, represent privatization. We're throwing the risk over the fence to private companies. I don't think that's rocket science, and it seems to me to be part and parcel of this grand march to move from defined benefit to defined contribution. That is a huge impact. Sachin Jain, I don't know if people listened to him yesterday. I thought he was absolutely outstanding. And I would say the third big driver is MA and the innovation opportunity itself. I think it's hard to overestimate the opportunity that is MA. And, in our world, we're seeing more and more organizations that aren't taking necessarily an MA only focus, but are certainly levering around MA, meaning they're trying to build a better mousetrap around MA, whether they're a payer, a provider, a support organization. That's going to have very significant implications, I think, for the rest of the business. It's going to have implications for the medical model we use. It's going to have implications for how we structure these relationships and so on and so forth. And I think as we think about seniors that are aging, we had a period of time from sort of late 90s Medicare Plus choice where there was significant concern about whether seniors that were aging into Medicare would accept a managed care option. But generationally, that concern has been wiped out, right? Because now we're seeing agents who have been, in many respects, their whole lives, they've been in health plans sponsored by their employers and those kinds of things. So these are all really, really, I think, significant, market drivers that we ought to all be thinking about. And when I talk about market-driven care, what I'm really talking about very specifically is, I think healthcare has lost its way because the consumer, and sometimes that's called the patient, is not really at the center of how we think and plan. I know the reason why that is because the economics haven't been driven, right? We've had a lack of consumer sovereignty for at least 50 years. So but I think that's going to be becoming more and more important. Obviously, everybody's focused on transparency. That sounds very trite, but I think there's a big push to drive more transparency. My big thing, and you see this in almost every sector, is the level of gross variation, the variation we can control, whether you read Marty McCary's book that talks about, community hospitals bankrupting communities, or you look at use rates of services, or you look at spending in the last 6 months of life, or you look at infection rates, or, pick it. We could probably identify literally 100 different things. And the variation that is prevalent in healthcare is variation that we would not accept in any other part of our life. My friend Steve Klasko, the CEO at Jefferson, has said, and he's dead on, all of the things that we take for granted in the 80% of our economic lives that are not related to healthcare are all obstacles in healthcare. And I think that's got to change and got to stop. And then finally, I'll close before I go to this next slide. I think there is a significant status quo loving component. There's a massive protectionist movement in healthcare. I don't think that takes a rocket science. The most significant healthcare lobbies are among the most significant advocacy organizations literally in the world. And a lot of those aren't necessarily aligned around what I would call true north principles. Now, I don't blame people for wanting to protect their interests, but I think we've got misalignment that has to be addressed. So the good news is all of these things can get addressed. And what I'm going to do now, if you would go, Kristen, move to the next slide, is just talk a little bit about my firm and how we approach this. So I said, I used the term growth accelerator. Think venture accelerator, but stage agnostic. Think about a firm with a capability set that can really meet growth stage companies where they are in the world I described, meet companies where they are, where they have gaps, where they have needs. A lot of those gaps, as we find, start out in the growth arena. It's pretty interesting to me that a lot of firms that get funded by a lot of the investments that get funded by PE firms, so-called growth capital, a lot of those businesses don't have a really strong growth strategy or understanding of how to really go to market in an integrated way, right? So we sort of think about this in a couple of different segments. One, and this is very high level, and again, this is sort of, I think, a derivation of how many people might approach this, but number one is having deep understanding and market knowledge and market intelligence and macro and focused research. And so one of the things that we thought was really important at our firm, Cannon Company, from the very beginning was that we build a world-class research team, competitive and market research team, a team that now has data science capabilities and are using advanced tools. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening in the data science world that sort of aids and abets both coming up with strategy, go-to-market, segmentation, messaging, all of those things, but also starts to understand buyer behaviors. A little bit of a Richard Thaler or Amos application of behavioral sort of economics theory. And I think it sort of starts here. And so one of the things that we find ourselves doing every day is we get up and say, hey, and by the way, we have tons of warts and don't know a lot, but we start by saying, hey, what don't we know that we really should know? Who don't we know that we really should talk to? What do we need to understand? Foundationally, what do we need to understand in these markets to sort of advance the cause of our customers? So, and if you think about our customers, are those coming to us saying, hey, help us grow, help us improve operationally, help us integrate technology, help us build sales strategy or sales enablement, help us build a channel strategy, help us drive an integrated marketing campaign, help us win. Okay. That's what our firms do. They come to us and say those things. And every day we're sort of asking this question, hey, do we have enough understanding of what's happening in these markets? So I think the starting point is we call this smart growth and value creation. One of my summary takeaways at the end, just to jump ahead a little bit, is I think, and Sachin also talked about this. This is the, again, I'm going to date myself. I think about this as almost like a MacGyver time in healthcare. There are so many, if you are creative, there are so many different opportunities to find revenue sources, technical assistance, capacity building, support for your companies. Okay. But you have to look at it from, there has to be a 360-degree view, and you have to look at it in some respects from, the non-conventional wisdom side of this. There are, as I call them, these whole bevy of, if you're a provider or if you're a technology platform, these CMMI innovation services, whether it's RPM, CCM, transitions of care, all of those activities, I view that as innovation funding. It's interesting that when you look at data, very few organizations have taken up that opportunity, provider organizations that could both improve quality and generate revenue, right? It's fascinating to me that post-COVID, we're seeing this massive pickup because in particular hospital systems that may have been very flush with cash flow positive are now really hurting. And people are starting to ask very basic questions about how can we find revenue, right? But that's a MacGyver dynamic, right? There could be non-dilutive dollars. How do we get access to non-dilutive dollars? But the biggest thing is for growth stage companies is, how do we build commercial connections and get beyond the dreaded P word, the pilot word? We don't want pilots. We want real commercial connections. And the other thing I would say about that is, thinking about adjacencies. I think it's trite to say that most successful businesses have done multiple pivots. Well, this happens all the time with our clients, where sometimes the first or second or even the third approach that we try is not as successful, but we find an adjacency, or we find a set of conditions that we can replicate and scale in terms of a growth opportunity, and we go to market. So next slide, please, Kristen. And I should say, by the way, I don't see everybody, but if you hit the raise hand or want to chime in, please do so. We've, and I think there are some marketing organizations. I saw the list of participants. We made a decision early on in our firm that we wanted to build a world-class marketing business inside of our firm. So people say, well, what are you? And I have trouble telling them what we are. For the professionals on the phone that have been around the investment business, I sort of think of us as almost like a merchant bank, and in the context of the merchant bank does or did whatever the client needed. Sometimes it was invest, sometimes it was arrange capital, sometimes it was advisor consult, sometimes it was find talent. And we've really replicated that model. We've put together a number of those capabilities. At the core of that, in addition to, as I mentioned, the research, was we wanted to have a world-class healthcare focused marketing business. And so we spent a lot of time, energy, and money to build that. And what we find with a lot of growth stage companies is they could really use this kind of support and discipline. They don't, and believe me, we're not of, I'm not of the opinion that those companies will need us forever, right? As I said, it's like you meet people where they are, but it's pretty interesting, I would say the uniformly woeful shape of commercial and marketing operations in growth stage companies, whether it's services, tech, payer. It's amazing to me. And the manifestations of this are wrong messaging, wrong targeting, wrong connectivity. We've worked with significantly sized organizations that have never talked to a C-level buyer. They've been able to sell somehow, but they've never been able to sell, at the right level. There's never really been that connectivity. So we thought it was important to put these component pieces together as part of our value strategy. Next slide, please. And one of the things I failed to mention, I should have mentioned, coming back to just consumer for a second, I think it's fair to say healthcare does not do well with consumer or retail, or no consumer or retail. I'm not suggesting that we absolutely do either, but this is an opening. This is part of why some of these insurgent firms are so bold. Obviously, the step one of why they're so bold is because of the economics and the arbitrage and the waste, right? All of the opportunity. Step two is there is, I think, a belief that consumer engagement, real consumer engagement, not the kind of stuff we talk about in healthcare, right? We talk about consumer engagement, provider engagement, patient engagement. It's all really soft stuff. I mean, if you want to engage patients, then, you're a firm that has an NPS of 70 or above, and you're really able to drive omni-channel sales, right? So those kinds of experiential capabilities in sales are not present in healthcare. And we think that they are going to become more and more and more important. So we've built those, or building those, I mean, just in terms of the investment. And, I'll give you a great example of how I've seen this manifested a little bit for those of you that are familiar with what's happening in the physician aggregator space around risk, risk-bearing entities and aggregating percentage of premium deals. There are a number of really smart, large primary care organizations or aggregators that have figured out that there is a way to start branding a physician group the way that Madison Avenue would brand a high quality brand, right? And measure the things that are important and validate the things that are important. And a couple of things interestingly happen. One is, believe it or not, the consumer, the patient does start to rely on the trusted brand for decision making, right? Which is something that we would expect. But in that context, in the context of a physician organization, they commoditize the health plans, right? The health plans start to look like noise in the background, right? How many physician groups, though, do you know that have been bold enough to step in front of their plan relationships and tell the consumer, we're going to own our relationship and the responsibility to ensure that you have a smooth relationship and you don't have to worry about the payer? I mean, how many times has that happened? It doesn't happen, right? So that kind of dynamic is changing. Anyway, so thank you. Wanted to mention that. The last part of our puzzle, or, the last part of the way that we think about this sort of is, is the transformation world. What's happening sort of under the hood. So we've got market research, we've got targeting, we've got a good go-to-market strategy and a growth strategy. How do we support those business activities from an operational perspective? How do we put the right talent in place, and technology, and drive technology integration? There are a number of these examples abound, right? If you're in the health services space, and you're either an investor or banker, and you are involved in aggregating services assets, physician assets, whatever those things might be, that is fraught with challenges, right? Particularly when you're buying assets that are on different technology platforms. Again, here's one of these examples of, in the 80% of our lives that are in healthcare, we really spend little time, and think about it. When's the last time you've heard somebody talk about the interoperability challenges in retail, right? Or electronics? It doesn't happen, okay? But there is a real barrier to execution success in the services roll-up world, because you've got to figure out how in the heck, what's our platform strategy? Are we going to move folks to that platform? How are we going to create data liquidity? And there are a lot of open questions about this right now, without question. So that's a big issue. Talent is always an issue. I'll tell you, interestingly enough, we're not a retail recruiter, but so many of our clients, particularly the sponsors and the sponsored back companies, ask us to get involved in helping the firms find talent, that we decided to build a talent business internally. Now we are in the knowledge business, we're in the talent business. So that ended up being beneficial for us. And we were able to do this in a way that we think we add a lot of value to customers, but in essence, we're in the talent business. Now, and when you spend time in that business, what do you find? Well, that's really become, even at the executive level, a very heavily transaction laden business. Even if you hire one of the best recruiters in the country, it's a transaction. There's a piece of paper. They're going and finding heads. It's the wrong sort of alignment, right? So we've learned and felt like that was very important. Our true north, as I said earlier, is this sort of market-based nirvana. So one way I think about that is, pretend for a second that all of the healthcare in a market were capitated. How would that change operating behavior in that market, right? Pretend it was all prepaid risk, okay? And we were in a model where, instead of really being top-down revenue-wise, we were bottom-up, trying to manage, sort of manage expenses. Now, that's an interesting exercise. It's a good scenario planning process. It's a great way to sort of unlock innovation. But I think in many respects, we are thinking about markets like that, because we're thinking about, the days of, you build it and they will come and everybody shows up, and regardless of the size of these markets, there's revenue. We believe those days are going to come to a close. There's going to be winners and losers. And so we are focused on, how do we help our clients, how do we help our clients win? In a lot of these scenarios, because of this market-based approach that we take, we end up, and it's been very fortuitous, we end up being able to introduce other clients. So, ostensibly we have a relationship with one client in a market, and we find that there's a lot of synergy between clients to solve problems. And in that way, we feel like we can connect the dots and add a lot of value in terms of the synergy that's created, in those relationships. So the management piece of this has to be a component piece. We also decided a number of years ago that we had to be willing to put our money where our mouth is and do turnaround and interim work, because we felt like, to be all in, we had to do that. And so we've built that stable and have done a lot of that kind of work. So that's been something that's been, again, not to say this is going to be everybody's interest or special sauce, but it's been something that we have found is important to us. Next slide, please. So in closing, and we're going to have, I think I'm going to end up being a little bit early, but there are really a couple of things that I wanted to say in summary, and just to have you think about it, and would love to, I'm sorry that this, the goal is not that this is a used car sales pitch. The goal of this is collaborative. I'd love to have discussions offline with folks, either questions or discussions offline with people, just about how we collaborate and share best practices. But a couple of things we're finding that I think are really important takeaways. As I mentioned earlier, one is particularly as it relates to services, and if you're in the services space, be as creative as you possibly can relative to payments and revenue. And my desk here is a mess, and I couldn't even find it if I wanted to. But as an example, there was a Federal Trade Commission thing that came out a couple of days ago, funding 9 or 10 fairly significant telehealth, telepresence activities. Now, whether they're in front of the market or behind the market, that's an open question. But the reality is, if you know about these things early on, you can help customers, you can help to get your clients into those deals. And we routinely do that. I mean, part of that sort of trying to have that market surveillance piece in place early is to be able to do that. Number two, be very flexible in how you think about those things. Somebody might be asking for, that's a same example, somebody's asking for telepresence, or somebody's asking for remote patient monitoring support, or somebody wants to be able to support distributed care management. Maybe you have a broad-based platform. I mean, the end game there is, and I always say to people, a big part of the challenge is, there's a bunch of challenges. A lot of firms can talk about this is where you should be in 10 years. And, we like to talk about that too. I'm not going to lie. But the reality is very few people are even remotely near where they need to be in 10 years. We're living in the here and now. This is the old fee for service versus risk argument, right? Like you hear people say the foot in two canoes. How do we bridge from today and tomorrow? And I think more importantly, how do we bridge from today to tomorrow in a way that there's fidelity to our future vision, right? So we're not just doing crazy stuff that generate revenue today, but there's, some thematic tie. So there's a lot of opportunity to think out of the box and be very flexible and very thoughtful about alternative revenue opportunities, alternative payment opportunities, reimbursement, and those things are changing all the time. That's something that I think is very important. To reinforce what I said earlier, I could be completely off base about this, and you may completely disagree. There's no question that the world that we are in is still very much a B2B business. If you doubt that, then go and rename something that sounds like Facebook and see if you can find a venture capital firm to fund a B2C play in healthcare. Good luck, and pound on sand and count your time. It's very difficult to get folks to focus because there is obviously this strong understanding that consumers don't control, the economics. But I would say to you, I think there is power in focusing on the consumer. The MA example I use pretty interesting. If you think about MA, and again, as an economist, I would say, like, part of what I hate about what's happened since really Lyndon Baines' Great Society is that we've lost almost all consumer sovereignty. I don't know if you guys know, you're educated, but in 1960 in this country, consumers represented about 50% of all purchase of healthcare. Consumer out of pocket, 50% of total spend, and Do y'all know what we spent as a percentage of GDP in 1960? We spent about 5 points of GDP, all right? Last year, what do you think we spent out of pocket? What did consumers, even with high deductibles and the growth in cost sharing, we were still well sub 20%, right? 20% consumer share in an economy rapidly, flexing to almost 20% of GDP. And so the question becomes, how do we get consumers engaged? But now think about MA for a second. Put aside that. What does MA represent? We overwhelmingly know that a number of segment groups are choosing MA. We know that African Americans and Latino Americans are voting with their feet, their pocketbook, and everything else to move to MA, right? We're now starting to educate families about MA. Why is that important? Well, if a patient can be cared for in their community, help to age in place, avoid or delay, the institutional entree for 3 months, 6 months, what is a year worth of deferral of entry into independent living or assisted living worth to families, right? So I do believe we're going to start to see some of these economics come to the fore. And I can tell you all from our firsthand experience, it is absolutely positively the belief of the Amazons, Walmarts, pharmacies, you think about plug in the blank, those retailers believe that the family is the economic unit, and they're going to be able to appeal to families writ large around the economics and healthcare and choices that are made. And I would not bet against them. So I think that's important focus on the consumer. As Dr. Jane said yesterday, MA is a very unique innovation opportunity. I would school on that as much as possible. And I'm using MA even writ large, like even think about senior strategy, okay? Because now we see direct primary care, rearing its head. There are a number of opportunities, innovative opportunities around those that your companies can take advantage of. It goes without saying to have a comprehensive aligned sales strategy. Almost every company that we work with, here's how the talk goes. They call us, they say, hey, we're not selling enough. Can you help us sell? What do you think help us sell means? That means, would you call people and introduce us? Because we're going to sell. Once we get in front of people, we sell. And so, number one, we don't do that. But, let's say that we do that and they fall flat on their face. And you say to them, hey, you really should spend some time, effort, and investment in aligning your messaging and your go-to-market strategy. And guess what their response is? We don't have that kind of money. We don't have that kind of time. But wait a second, you're not selling effectively, okay? So I would say that a comprehensive sales strategy, both direct and channel, is a really important part of this thing. And then the last thing I'll close with, and again, I think at least 99% of everything I've said, you all could have said for me. So I appreciate your indulgence. Execution is a differentiation strategy, particularly in a segment that's been such a poor aggregate executor on outcomes writ large. And so anyway, with that, I just want to thank you all for putting up with me on Friday before your virtual drinks.
Hey, Don.
Would love any questions.
Yes, we have time for questions. We have about 10 minutes.
So that means I'm in trouble because I didn't go long enough. So I'm going to hear this from my colleagues. But any comments or any thoughts or anything that I said that pisses you off?
I got a comment, Don. It was good stuff. Thank you. And Will Bush III from FMG Leading.
Hey, Will. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We do a lot of work in this space with sponsors, particularly in the distributed healthcare space.
Yep.
And one of the things we're seeing and thinking about is on the aging side, right? A lot of that is propped up by the fact that a lot of consumers have 10 to 14 scripts associated with them that they take per year, right? And so as we move to more of a health conscious economy, where are we seeing dollars flow, right, on the preventive side? So I'd be curious, just as you do your work, what are some of the interesting things on kind of the preventative side to say, hey, look, let's keep you out of traditional models of care and off the scripts. And these are the new assets and delivery models to help prevent some of that stuff. So what are you seeing, Don, in the work you do?
You know what, that is such a fantastic question, Will, and I would love to have more follow-up offline because I think we could have a really nice discussion. But let me tell you a couple things. And as I said early on, this is, I think, where the puck is going, and we're spending a ton of time and we're learning a lot. We do a lot of eclectic things. Eclectic means other people say, that's really stupid. Why in the hell would you do that? But, you know, we do it because we think it's valuable. One of those is, among other things, we run a clinical specialty society called the American Academy of Home Care Medicine, which is home-based primary care physicians. It's basically, you know, PCPs and advanced practice nurses that make house calls, primary care house calls, not home health, right? So you start to think about how that feathers into an overall go-to-market strategy about value-based care. And by the way, for those of you that have familiarity with RAF scores and those kinds of things, what do you think sort of the average RAF score of a homebound patient that's being treated in home by a primary care clinician is? Give me an idea. One's the unit score, right? About 3. So guess what happens to that patient living in their home if one of our home-based primary care practitioners is not treating them? They're in an institutional setting and their cost went way up, right? And now we know there's all kinds of things happening. You know, we know Amazon and Walmart both are testing in a number of markets. They're not just delivering stuff. They're putting the stuff away, right? With smart appliances, they're starting to capture these things. We're seeing a lot of that sort of digital uptake. So that's something that you know, we're seeing a lot of, number one. Within that home care movement, interestingly enough, because of what happened recently with pain parity post-COVID, and there's actually, I didn't say this, I'm Baltimore based, I'm a Baltimorean, and my office is in East Baltimore. And literally, you know, as the crow flies, a half a mile away is the guy who is like the most preeminent researcher. He's been researching 30 years the concept of hospital at home. It's been largely an academic research exercise, right? Because why? Because of payment, because the payment system limited, right? But now all of a sudden, guess what? People are starting to think about, what could we do in the home? And now there's almost this notion of, well, geez, the question really is what has to be done in the institution? It's almost like we're whipsawing this thing, right? And you're now seeing companies that are doing all kinds of things. So those are a couple examples, Will. I mean, there are you know, many more, but I think you're very much onto something. And the last thing that I would say about that is when you think about the power of digitization. So let's say, you know, Will, you're in, where are you from, Will? Where are you live?
From St. Louis, Missouri, living in Chicago.
You live in Chicago, but hey, St. Louis, by the way, the St. Louis Browns are now the Orioles. You know, I don't know if you knew that, but so thank you for the baseball team. But anyway, that was in 1954. St. Louis is a great town, very much like Baltimore. But let's say you're in St. Louis and your mom lives in Philadelphia, or your dad, and they're reasonably healthy, but they're starting to, you know, to have some issues. Well, digitization allows you to stay connected to them in a meaningful way if you have the right support. So this is real stuff now, you know, that's starting to happen. And you have a vested interest for a whole host of reasons. I would argue, including economic reasons, why you'd like to see mom or dad age in place or get the kind of care the high quality care they can get in the community. So it's a very exciting time to be there. Will, thank you.
You bet. Thanks, Don.
I have a question. Liz. It's Liz Hughes. I'm in the UK at the moment.
Thank you for staying up with us. Well, you're not that late, but you know.
Oh, it's not that late. It's not.
So who's your PPL team, Liz? Who's your favorite Premier League team?
Newcastle United.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm a Liverpool guy, but that's okay.
Oh well, my husband's an Evertonian, so there might be a bit of a.
That's the big comp. We'll have to fight. Yeah.
Anyway, I couldn't agree with you more with regard to the power of the patient. And I have done consultancy argumentation with the government based on the power of the patient. So I agree with that. My question to you is, and I don't know whether this is the correct forum, is the lower middle income countries and the new and emerging economies are spending a lot extra on healthcare. Mm-hmm. So I just wondered what your opinion is on that as an opportunity overall.
Oh, I think there's a massive opportunity. And, you know, I think that you know, with this great technology, that sort of level sets, I call it like the David Goliath dynamic where, you know, relatively small players can improve. I think that healthcare on the, you know, healthcare in certainly in the US, I don't think we lack on the discovery innovation product side, if you will, right? The delivery, the therapeutics. We lack process innovation, but more of these things are going to be delivered. I mean, digitization drives barriers down, right? So I really believe there are massive opportunities in the developing world. And also I would say, and I'm glad you raised this point, and it would be an interesting discussion because you're in a socially planned health economy, right? And we're in a pluralistic economy. We're by no means a market economy, but it's a little bit different. But you know, the big knock against the US is, you know, we're spending a lot of money on healthcare, but we don't spend enough money on social service support. You'll hear some of that sort of thing. But I view healthcare as expanding. Like when we talk about healthcare, I say, okay, the center concentric circle is the sickness business in the US. That's the $3.7 trillion business. But now all of a sudden there's this social determinants, there's housing, there's a bunch of other things. And we're starting to see, at least in the US, that some of the larger actors have the ability to influence and there may be dollars there. So I think you want to think very holistically even about social supports. And then, you know, just a ton of traditional opportunities around, you know, quality improvement stuff. In the developing world, you know, one of the things I've always been struck by is I think the innovation has to happen locally. Like I think, you know, and there are these classic case studies, but, you know, you think about, you know, we develop something in the US and we develop an ultrasound machine that costs $500,000. Well, you know, that's not going to fly in India. No. Right. But you need somebody who develops something that can, you know, cost $1,000, right? You know, I don't know, sort of the bottom of the pyramid thing, but I love that world and would love to talk with you more about that offline, Liz.
Look forward to it, Don. Thank you so much.
Thank you for staying up for us. Or staying home from the pub anyway, right, Liz? It's Friday. So.
Oh, we can't get out at the moment.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. All right.
Sadly.
It's about 1:45, folks. We're supposed to shut down now. If there's any other questions or comments, maybe we can do one more, but I just want to thank you all for spending time with me this afternoon, and hopefully it wasn't a complete waste of time.
It was great. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, guys. Thanks all.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Take care.
Thank you.